A cowboy was forced to marry an old maid. She slowly took over his heart. Jake McAllister had always been a man of the open plains. The endless horizon, the soft sway of wheat fields, and the whisper of the wind through the mountains were his home. He loved the life of a cowboy, the freedom, the horses, the sense of being his own master. People in his small town often admired him for his skill with a horse and a lasso, but also for his independent spirit. He had a charm that could make anyone smile, yet he was fiercely protective of his freedom, never wanting to be tied down. But life has a way of turning plans upside down. Jake's father had always been a practical man, believing in the importance of family, social standing, and tradition. When a neighboring family approached with an urgent request, Jake found himself facing a situation he had never imagined. The Smith family, respectable landowners in the town, wanted their daughter Martha to marry Jake. Martha was known as the old maid of the town. She was in her late 20s, quiet, modest, and had never married. The townspeople whispered about her, often casting her in a pitiful light. But the Smiths insisted. They saw in Jake a strong man who could provide a stable life for their daughter. Jake had no say in the matter. His father reminded him firmly that it was not just a request but an obligation to honor the family and maintain the town's expectations. The young cowboy was furious. He had spent years roaming freely, trusting only himself and his horses, and now he was being pushed into a life he had not chosen. The idea of marrying someone he barely knew, or someone the town had labeled an old maid, felt like a trap. The wedding day arrived quietly without the grandeur of large celebrations. It was a simple gathering at the small church in town. Jake wore his best coat, his boots polished, but his heart was heavy with resentment. Martha walked in with calm composure. She had a gentle smile, and though she carried herself with quiet dignity, there was a nervous tremor in her hands. She was fully aware of the whispers that followed her in the town, the quiet jokes, the pitying looks. But she did not argue, did not fight. Martha understood her place and accepted her circumstances with a grace that Jake could not yet appreciate. The ceremony was short. Vows were exchanged, hands were shaken, and the two were pronounced husband and wife. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He looked at Martha and saw only the polite smile of a stranger. There was no spark, no connection, only the sense that life had suddenly become more complicated. Martha, on the other hand, felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that the day had arrived without drama, and anxiety over the unknown life that awaited her. Their journey home was silent. Jake rode ahead, the reins in his strong hands, while Martha followed in the carriage. She had packed a few belongings, keeping them neat and orderly, a reflection of her careful nature. Jake could not hide his irritation at the quiet that stretched between them. He wanted conversation, jokes, anything to break the tension, but Martha remained composed. She greeted him politely when necessary, answered questions with measured honesty, and refrained from showing any disappointment at his coldness. Life together began in the small cabin on Jake's ranch. It was modest but comfortable, a space that reflected Jake's practical needs more than Martha's hopes. At first, their interactions were purely functional. Jake would issue instructions for the day, feeding the cattle, mending fences, checking the horses, and Martha would quietly follow through. She had learned much from her family and took to ranch life naturally, tending to the chores with diligence. Jake noticed her efficiency but did not yet see her as more than a capable helper. Martha, for her part, did not complain about Jake's distant behavior. She understood that forcing a bond was not possible. Instead, she focused on making the home orderly, keeping the animals well fed, and gradually learning the rhythms of the ranch. She cooked simple, hearty meals, often leaving them warm on the table for Jake, who would sometimes grunt his approval or nod before returning to his work. She took care not to overstep, allowing him his space, while quietly observing his routines, his habits, and even his moods. In those early weeks, Jake found himself irritated more often than he expected. He was used to living alone, answering only to himself and the land. Having another person in his life, especially someone he felt he had no interest in, felt intrusive. He chafed at Martha's quiet attentiveness, thinking it unnecessary or even nosy. Yet there were moments he could not ignore, like the way she handled the horses with care, noticing small ailments or injuries he might have missed, or how she remembered the schedule of chores without him reminding her. The town, as always, watched closely. Neighbors would occasionally stop by, offering polite smiles, advice, or subtle judgment. "She'll never catch him," they whispered. "Poor girl married a man who barely notices her." These murmurs reached both Jake and Martha, though he pretended not to care and she ignored them with quiet dignity. Martha did not let gossip define her, and slowly Jake began to notice her strength, not in words but in action. One evening, after a long day of work on the ranch, Jake returned to find Martha waiting with a simple meal. The sun had dipped behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the fields. He sat down, still irritated from the day, but noticed the effort she had made. She had not demanded gratitude or attention, she simply provided what was needed. For the first time, Jake felt a flicker of respect, though he quickly pushed it aside. He was still unwilling to admit that Martha's quiet competence mattered. Nights were the hardest. Sharing the same bed felt awkward and unnatural. Jake kept to himself, staring at the ceiling, listening to Martha's steady breathing. Martha, on the other hand, remained patient, aware that affection could not be forced. She understood that Jake's heart was guarded, shaped by years of independence, and she resolved to let time work its magic. In the silence, she occasionally let her mind wander to small hopes, small gestures, soft smiles, and tiny connections that might someday draw them closer. One weekend, a minor accident on the ranch brought them into an unexpected closeness. Jake had slipped while checking the fence, and Martha was there to help him up. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, and for a moment, Jake felt a strange warmth. He had always been self-reliant, and accepting help was not easy, yet Martha's presence felt reassuring. He did not say anything, and she did not push him to speak, but something shifted in that quiet moment, a tiny crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Despite these small moments, Jake's pride remained. He still viewed Martha as someone fulfilling an obligation rather than a partner. Yet, he could not ignore her presence. She was everywhere in the rhythms of his life, cooking, cleaning, caring for the animals, organizing supplies, and sometimes simply sitting beside him in quiet companionship. Slowly, her consistency, patience, and unwavering calm began to contrast sharply with the chaos and unpredictability of his own life. By the end of the first part of their marriage, Jake was still resistant. He had not admitted it to anyone, not even himself, but he was beginning to notice Martha in ways that mattered. Her quiet laugh, the careful way she handled each task, her patience when he grew irritable, all these things were gradually eroding his initial resentment. He was forced to acknowledge that life with Martha was not as unbearable as he had feared, though he would never call it enjoyment, not yet. Martha, on the other hand, had settled into her role with quiet grace. She had not rushed Jake, had not demanded affection, and had not sought to change him. Instead, she had become part of the rhythms of the ranch and his life, waiting for the moments when their worlds might gently collide in understanding and perhaps something more. As the sun set behind the rolling hills and the stars began to appear in the clear night sky, Jake sat outside, staring at the horizon. Martha brought him a blanket, placing it gently over his shoulders. He looked at her for the first time without irritation, noticing the soft determination in her eyes. She smiled quietly and returned to her chores, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time, Jake wondered, Maybe, just maybe, this marriage was not a punishment, but an unexpected path to something he had never considered: companionship, respect, and perhaps even love. Life on the ranch began to settle into a rhythm, and with it, the quiet tension between Jake and Martha started to shift in subtle ways. The days were long, filled with the steady routines of ranch work: feeding the cattle, mending fences, checking on the horses, and tending to the fields. At first, these routines had only reminded Jake of the responsibilities he had never wanted, but now he began to notice something he hadn't seen before. Martha was extraordinary in her quiet way. She rose before dawn each morning, preparing the small cabin for the day. Breakfast was always ready, fresh and hearty, often including eggs from their own hens, fresh bread, and hot coffee that filled the cabin with a comforting aroma. She never fussed if Jake arrived late or if he complained about a minor inconvenience. She simply served the meal and smiled politely. At first, Jake had ignored her efforts, thinking them unnecessary. But gradually, he began to see that her care was not an attempt to control him, but a simple act of kindness, done without expectation. One morning, as the sun painted the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Jake watched Martha from the porch as she moved among the horses. She handled each one with a gentle confidence, checking their hooves and brushing their coats until they gleamed. He had always thought of horses as tools of the trade, but watching her, he saw that they were more than that. They were living beings, deserving of attention and care. Jake felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He respected her skill, and more than that, he admired the patience with which she worked. Martha's influence began to extend beyond the chores. She organized the supplies in the barn, labeling feed and tools, making the ranch easier to manage. She took note of what needed fixing and quietly ensured the work was done. Jake started to realize that her intelligence was practical and grounded in experience. She was not demanding or critical. She simply made life run more smoothly. At first, he was reluctant to admit it, but he found himself relying on her presence without realizing it. The small town, ever watchful, had its own opinions. Neighbors would sometimes stop by, curious about the marriage of the young cowboy and the old maid. Some whispered doubts, while others offered cautious praise. "She's keeping him in line," one neighbor commented quietly. "We'll see how long it lasts," another muttered. Jake ignored them, but he noticed the way Martha handled these intrusions. She never argued, never complained, and never let their words affect her work. Her calm demeanor in the face of gossip fascinated him. It was a strength he had rarely encountered, and he couldn't deny that it intrigued him. Gradually, the interactions between Jake and Martha shifted from purely functional to moments of quiet companionship. One afternoon, Jake was repairing a fence that had been damaged by a storm. He struggled with a stubborn post, and Martha came to help without being asked. She held the post steady while he hammered it into place. "Here, let me help," she said softly. Jake grunted but allowed her to assist. For the first time, he felt a small spark of something he hadn't expected, a sense of partnership. He realized that her presence made the work easier, not because she was forcing herself into his life, but because she genuinely wanted to help. Over time, these small gestures became meaningful. Martha remembered the little details: how Jake liked his coffee, the way he preferred the barn organized, the hours he worked best. She never imposed her way, but subtly adjusted her actions to fit into his routines. Jake began to notice these details, and though he would never admit it aloud, he appreciated her thoughtfulness. Her patience and attentiveness contrasted sharply with his own impulsiveness, and it made him think about the way he treated others, including himself. Evenings brought new challenges. Jake was not used to companionship, and sharing space with Martha felt awkward. At first, they sat in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. But slowly, conversations began to emerge. It was never forced. Jake might ask about the animals or comment on the weather. and Martha would respond with practical advice, sprinkled with a touch of humor or a gentle observation. Sometimes they laughed quietly over a shared mistake or a clumsy horse, and in those moments, Jake felt a warmth he hadn't expected. Martha also had a way of listening that made Jake uneasy. She did not offer judgment or criticism. She simply heard him. When he vented about a difficult day or a stubborn task, she would nod, sometimes offer a solution, sometimes just sit quietly. Jake had never encountered someone who could accept him without trying to change him. At first, he resisted the comfort her presence brought, thinking it made him weak to rely on anyone. But gradually, he found that he looked forward to her calm, steady company. One particularly cold morning, Jake had stayed out too long checking on a sick horse. He returned to the cabin exhausted, chilled to the bone. Martha had built a small fire in the stove and prepared warm tea. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and offered him a soft smile. For the first time, Jake felt a flicker of gratitude that went beyond politeness. He was not used to care that came without expectation, and he could not deny that it mattered to him. He drank the tea in silence, letting the warmth seep into his body and, unknowingly, into his heart. The turning point came during a minor incident on the ranch. A calf had gotten loose and wandered toward the river. Jake chased after it, but the terrain was slippery and dangerous. Martha, without hesitation, followed him and helped guide the calf back safely. Her courage and calmness in a tense situation surprised Jake. He realized that Martha was not the timid, fragile woman he had imagined. She was capable, brave, and intelligent, able to think clearly under pressure. That realization unsettled him in a way he had never felt before. Respect began to grow, and with respect came a new curiosity about her. As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself noticing Martha more and more. The way she moved through the barn, the gentle way she handled the animals, the quiet laughter she let slip when he made a joke, these things began to linger in his mind. He could not admit it yet, but a small part of him was intrigued by her, drawn to her consistency and her ability to remain steady in a world that often felt chaotic. Martha, meanwhile, remained patient. She understood that Jake's heart was slow to trust, slow to open, and she allowed the natural rhythm of life to carry them closer, step by step. Their evenings gradually became moments of connection. They would sit together by the fire, talking about simple things, the weather, the work on the ranch, childhood memories. Jake began to share small stories from his past, and Martha would listen with interest, asking gentle questions that encouraged him without pressing too far. It was a slow dance of trust, each learning about the other in small increments. One quiet night after a particularly long day, Jake caught himself watching Martha as she folded laundry. She hummed softly, absorbed in the simple task. He realized with a mixture of surprise and unease that he admired her patience and dedication. It was a feeling he did not understand yet, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and an unfamiliar warmth. He quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, but the thought lingered. The first part of their life together had been challenging, filled with adjustment, tension, and quiet frustration. But the second part revealed the subtle shifts that would eventually shape their relationship. Martha's consistent presence, her quiet strength, and her patient understanding were slowly breaking down the walls Jake had built around his heart. She had not forced affection, but had allowed small moments of connection to emerge naturally, planting the seeds of something deeper. By the end of these weeks, Jake found himself thinking about Martha more often than he expected. Her care, intelligence, and quiet humor had begun to touch him in ways he had not anticipated. He was still resistant to admitting it, still clinging to his pride and independence, but a small, undeniable truth was forming in the background of his mind. Martha was more than a wife he had been forced to marry. She was becoming a companion, a partner, and perhaps, in time, someone he could truly care for. The days ahead promised challenges as the ranch life continued to test their endurance, and the town continued to watch with curiosity. But in the quiet moments in the work shared together, and in the small acts of kindness and care, Jake's heart was beginning to notice something he had never thought possible. Martha was slowly taking hold of it, piece by piece, without force, without words, and without him. Realizing just how deeply she had begun to matter, Jake McAllister had begun to notice changes in himself that both surprised and unsettled him. The long, quiet days on the ranch were no longer just a matter of chores and routine. They had begun to carry subtle moments of connection, thanks to Martha's steady presence. He found himself thinking about her when she wasn't around, recalling the way she had handled the horses, the way she had guided the lost calf back to safety, and even the quiet smile she gave when he cracked a joke, however dry it was. He resisted the thought, telling himself it was nothing more than acknowledgement of her competence. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if there was more to it. Life on the ranch had its share of hardships, and one morning brought a challenge that neither Jake nor Martha could have anticipated. A sudden spring storm swept across the fields, bringing heavy rain and strong winds. The cattle were scattered across the pasture, some struggling to find shelter, while the horses were restless and nervous. Jake, experienced as he was, ran from one group to another, shouting commands, trying to gather the animals. But the storm was relentless, and his frustration grew with each passing hour. Martha moved alongside him, calm and steady. "Jake, let me help with the northern pasture," she said, and without waiting for a reply, she disappeared into the rain, her coat soaked through. Jake felt a flicker of surprise. He had not expected her to take such initiative. But he also felt a strange sense of relief. The work was overwhelming and her presence made it manageable. Together, they rounded up the cattle, guiding them toward the barn. At one point, a frightened horse bolted, and Martha calmly stepped in, using her experience and patience to soothe it until it followed her to safety. Jake watched, amazed, as she handled the chaos with more grace than he ever could have managed alone. After the storm passed, the cabin was soaked, the fields muddy, and the animals settled but tired. Jake was exhausted, his clothes clinging to him, and yet he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire that Martha had prepared. She handed him a warm towel, her hands gentle as she dried his face. "You did well today," she said softly, and for the first time, Jake realized that he had relied on her more than he wanted to admit. Her strength had become a part of his world, and he could not deny the admiration stirring in his heart. The days that followed brought more small moments that chipped away at Jake's pride and indifference. He began to notice the thoughtful things Martha did, not the big gestures, but the little ones that spoke of her care and attention. She mended his worn gloves without being asked, replaced a broken fence board before he even knew it was damaged, and left his favorite meal on the table when he returned from long hours in the sun. Each act was quiet and unassuming, but together they began to form a pattern that Jake could not ignore. One evening, after a long day of checking fences and tending the animals, Jake sat on the porch, exhausted and frustrated. Martha brought him a cup of coffee, steam curling in the cold air. She sat beside him quietly, not speaking at first. Jake sipped the coffee, feeling its warmth seep into him, and then noticed her hand brush against his, almost by accident. He looked at her startled, but she simply smiled, her eyes calm and unassuming. For the first time, Jake felt something stir in his chest, a feeling that was tender, unspoken, and entirely new. He looked away quickly, afraid to admit that her presence was starting to matter more than he wanted to accept. Their conversations, once strictly about chores and practical matters, began to take on a new depth. One night, as they watched the sun set over the hills, Jake found himself speaking more openly than he ever had. He shared stories of his childhood, of the first time he had ridden a horse alone, of the mistakes he had made in his youth. Martha listened with quiet interest, her eyes reflecting understanding, never judgment. She asked gentle questions, encouraging him to reflect and share without pressure. For the first time in years, Jake felt truly heard. Martha, in turn, shared parts of her own life, not stories of grandeur, but moments that revealed her character. How she had cared for her younger siblings, how she had managed the family farm, and how she had learned patience in a world that often undervalued her. Jake listened, fascinated, realizing that the woman he had once dismissed as timid and insignificant was intelligent, capable, and full of quiet courage. The admiration he felt began to grow into something more, though he resisted acknowledging it. A small accident brought their bond even closer. One afternoon, Jake had been attempting to fix a section of the fence near the creek. He slipped on the wet ground and twisted his ankle badly. Martha was there in an instant, steadying him and helping him back to the cabin. She did not panic, did not fuss. She simply assessed the injury, prepared a makeshift bandage, and guided him inside. Jake, frustrated and embarrassed by his vulnerability, wanted to brush it off. But as he hobbled beside her, leaning on her for support, he realized how much he had come to rely on her presence, not just for practical help, but for reassurance and comfort. Evenings became a time of reflection for Jake. He would sit by the fire, thinking about the day, about the storm, the animals, and the quiet ways Martha had eased his burdens. He could no longer deny that she mattered to him, though he struggled to define the feeling. It was not love, at least not yet, but it was something that nudged at the edges of his heart, persistent and insistent. He found himself waiting for her small smiles, her gentle words, and the quiet confidence she exuded. Martha's patience remained unwavering. She never pushed Jake, never demanded affection or gratitude, and never rushed the development of their bond. She understood that Jake's heart was slow to open, shaped by years of independence and self-reliance. Instead, she let moments unfold naturally, offering kindness and care in ways that required no acknowledgement. She understood that true connection could not be forced, and that sometimes the quietest gestures were the most powerful. The first winter on the ranch tested them both. Cold winds swept across the plains, and heavy snow made the work even more difficult. Jake struggled with the physical demands, while Martha, undeterred, continued her routines, ensuring the animals were safe and the home was warm. One particularly harsh evening, a blizzard made travel nearly impossible. Jake was frustrated and exhausted, but Martha remained calm, lighting the stove, preparing hot food, and tending to the animals with unwavering determination. Jake watched her, realizing that her strength and resilience were becoming essential to his life. By now, Jake was beginning to recognize a new kind of connection between them. It was not the fiery passion he had imagined marriage to bring, nor the irritation he had feared. It was a quiet, steady companionship that grounded him, offered comfort, and made life on the ranch feel less lonely. He found himself thinking about Martha when she was not around, noticing her absence and missing her calm presence. Yet despite these growing feelings, Jake still struggled with pride. He had been taught to be self-reliant, to face the world alone, and to rely on his own strength. Admitting that he needed Martha, even in the smallest ways, felt like vulnerability he was not ready to embrace. But life had a way of teaching lessons slowly, and every day with Martha chipped away at his defenses. Her quiet confidence, her patience, and her unwavering care were slowly breaking through the walls he had built around his heart. One quiet evening, as they sat together by the fire, Jake felt a shift within himself. Martha had shared a small story about her childhood, about helping her mother with chores and learning the value of patience. Jake realized that the strength he admired in her was not just practical skill, it was character, resilience, and kindness. He felt a spark of respect that was deeper than admiration, tinged with something warmer, something he was not yet ready to name. The week ended with another small but meaningful moment. Jake had been repairing the barn roof when he lost his balance and nearly fell. Martha was there before he could call out, steadying him and guiding him down safely. He looked at her then, really looked, noticing the determination in her eyes, the calm steadiness of her hands, and the quiet courage that had carried them both through storms, blizzards, and everyday struggles. For the first time, Jake felt a flicker of genuine appreciation, mingled with an unfamiliar warmth. By the end of this part of their story, Jake and Martha had settled into a delicate balance. Jake's pride and independence remained, but they were tempered by a growing admiration and reliance on Martha. Martha's patience, strength, and quiet understanding had begun to shape their relationship, allowing small sparks of connection to emerge. Neither fully understood the depth of what was developing between them, but it was clear that the bond was growing, slowly, gently, and persistently. The challenges of ranch life, the unpredictable weather, and the demands of daily work had forged a partnership, one built not on obligation, but on shared experience, respect, and care. Jake was beginning to realize that Martha was more than the old maid the town had labeled her. She was a remarkable woman, and her presence was quietly taking root in his heart. Spring had come to the plains, bringing longer days, warmer sun, and new life across the ranch. The pastures were green, the horses frolicked, and the calves had grown stronger under the careful watch of both Jake and Martha. Life was beginning to feel smoother, though not without its challenges. The seasons always demanded hard work, and the ranch was never without surprises. But now, for the first time, Jake felt a sense of partnership with Martha, a shared purpose that neither could ignore. It started with small things, the kind of moments that quietly change a relationship without anyone realizing at first. Jake noticed Martha before he had ever truly done so. He watched how her hands moved as she braided a young colt's mane, how her eyes lit up when the animals responded to her care, and how her voice carried a gentle authority that even the older ranch hands respected. He found himself thinking, without meaning to, about the warmth she brought to the cabin, the way she remembered the smallest details, and the patience she had with the stubborn animals he sometimes gave up on. One morning, a new challenge tested both of them. A neighboring farmer's fence had collapsed, letting his cattle stray onto Jake's land. The storm from the previous week had weakened several fences, and the result was a chaotic scene of mingling herds. Jake was already exhausted from early chores, his hands rough and blistered from handling the ranch work. But Martha, without hesitation, pulled on her boots and said, "We can do this together." They rode out to the edge of the fields, and Martha took the lead with the smaller, more frightened calves, guiding them gently while Jake rounded up the larger cattle. She never faltered, even when one of the calves tried to bolt toward a muddy ditch. Her calm and steady demeanor was infectious. Jake realized with a mixture of awe and humility that he could not have managed this alone. Her presence was not just helpful, it was necessary. And with that thought came an unfamiliar feeling, gratitude tinged with admiration, and slowly, something deeper. By midday, the cattle were returned safely, the fences temporarily patched, and Jake felt exhaustion and relief in equal measure. He had relied on Martha's skills and her calm judgment more than he had expected, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. He glanced at her as she wiped sweat from her brow, the sunlight catching her hair, and felt a spark of something that went beyond respect. He looked away quickly, unwilling to confront what was growing in his heart. The afternoons that followed were quieter, though no less meaningful. Jake and Martha would sit together, repairing fences or preparing feed, talking about the future of the ranch. Jake began to share his dreams, not just practical plans, but ideas for expanding the land, caring for the animals better, and improving the cabin. Martha listened intently, asking questions and offering suggestions that showed both intelligence and insight. She never imposed her opinion, but her advice was thoughtful and careful, making Jake see her not just as a capable helper, but as a partner in decision-making. One evening, the true test of their bond arrived. A fire broke out in one of the hay barns, likely sparked by a stray ember from a stove. Smoke curled into the sky, and flames licked the edges of the wooden structure. Jake ran toward the barn instinctively, but Martha was already there, grabbing a bucket of water and working quickly to stop the fire from spreading. The two of them worked side by side, moving hay, dousing flames, and coordinating their efforts with precise efficiency. The adrenaline of the moment left Jake breathless, but it also left him noticing something he had never admitted before. He depended on her, not just for help, but for strength and clarity in moments of crisis. When the fire was finally under control, Jake looked at Martha, his chest heaving from exertion. He saw the determination in her eyes, the way she had calmly faced danger, and the selfless courage she had displayed. His pride wavered, replaced by a deep admiration and an unexpected warmth. For the first time, he allowed himself to think that he might not only respect Martha, but also care for her in ways he had never imagined. Martha, sensing his gaze, smiled softly, and though she said nothing, the unspoken connection between them deepened. After the fire, life returned to the usual rhythm, but the events had changed something inside Jake. He began to notice Martha in ways he had never done before. Her laugh when she found a calf tangled in a fence, the way she carefully tended the garden, the quiet pride she took in small victories. Each day brought small reminders of her strength, patience, and intelligence, and each reminder chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. Evenings became moments of shared reflection and quiet intimacy. Jake found himself lingering longer by the fire, listening to Martha's stories about her family, her childhood, and her experiences on the farm. She spoke with honesty and warmth, never bragging, never seeking attention, but simply sharing her life. Jake, for the first time in years, felt that he could open up without fear of judgment. He began to speak about his own life, his childhood adventures, his mistakes, and even his fears about managing the ranch alone. Martha's gentle understanding and patient listening were comforting in ways he had never experienced before. One particularly cold night, as snow began to fall lightly outside, Jake and Martha sat close by the fire, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the chill in the air. Jake caught himself staring at her, noticing the soft curve of her smile, the quiet confidence in her eyes, and the grace with which she moved even in simple chores. He felt a flutter in his chest he could not explain, a mixture of respect, warmth, and a quiet longing. He quickly looked away, ashamed of his own feelings, but they lingered nonetheless. The weeks that followed brought even more opportunities for shared experiences. They worked together to repair fences damaged by the thawing snow, tended the animals with meticulous care, and planned the planting of spring crops. Each task, no matter how small, became a moment of connection. Jake began to notice that Martha's opinions mattered, not just in chores, but in decisions about the ranch's future. Her insight was practical, grounded, and thoughtful, and he began to trust her judgment more than his own in some matters. Jake's friends and neighbors started to notice the change as well. The young cowboy, once known for his stubborn independence, was now seen consulting Martha, listening to her advice, and even laughing quietly at her subtle humor. People whispered about the transformation quietly, noting that the old maid was no longer just a silent partner. She was influencing the man's life in ways that were impossible to ignore. Jake, however, remained unaware of how obvious his growing affection had become. He simply knew that life with Martha was better, calmer, and somehow more complete. A particularly tender moment came when Jake injured his hand while fixing a fence. Martha immediately attended to it, cleaning the cut carefully, wrapping it with a cloth, and insisting he rest. Jake, stubborn as always, tried to protest, but Martha's insistence left him no choice. As she gently tended to him, he realized the depth of her care, not just for him as a husband, but for him as a person. The thought unsettled him, but it also warmed him in a way he could not ignore. By now, the bond between them was undeniable. Jake found himself looking for Martha's presence, feeling a sense of comfort when she was nearby, and experiencing a pang of disappointment when she was occupied elsewhere. Martha's patience and gentle guidance had gradually transformed their marriage from one of obligation to one of companionship. He admired her strength, relied on her judgment, and slowly, without fully understanding it himself, was beginning to care for her deeply. Their connection culminated in a quiet moment one evening when they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. Jake reached for Martha's hand almost instinctively, and she did not pull away. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of the cattle, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant neigh of horses. For the first time, Jake felt that he was not just living alongside Martha, but truly sharing his life with her. The warmth in his chest was undeniable, and though he did not yet have the words to describe it, he felt a quiet certainty that she had begun to take hold of his heart. As night fell and stars appeared in the clear sky, Jake realized something he had never admitted before. Martha had become essential to his life. She had slowly moved from the background to the center, her patience, strength, and kindness reshaping his world. He did not yet call it love, but it was something equally powerful, a deep respect, admiration, and a growing attachment that could not be denied. The challenges of ranch life, the unpredictable weather, and the long hours of work had brought them together in ways neither could have foreseen. Martha's quiet courage, intelligence, and unwavering care had transformed their marriage into a partnership, and Jake, stubborn and proud though he was, felt his heart opening in ways he had never imagined. The seasons continued to pass, and the ranch had begun to flourish under the combined efforts of Jake and Martha. The fields were green and full of life, the horses strong and healthy, and the cattle well cared for. But more than the land, the bond between Jake and Martha had grown in ways that neither of them could have predicted at the start of their marriage. What had begun as an arrangement forced by family expectations had transformed into something far deeper, something neither could deny any longer. It was a crisp morning when Jake awoke to find Martha already in the barn, tending to the animals before the sun had fully risen. He paused for a moment, watching her move gracefully among the horses and cows, her hands steady, her eyes attentive. The sight filled him with an unfamiliar warmth. He realized that her presence had become more than comforting, she had become essential. The thought startled him. He had spent years valuing his independence, his freedom, yet he could not imagine the ranch or his life without her. Breakfast was quiet but filled with an unspoken understanding. Martha had prepared eggs, fresh bread, and coffee, placing the warm cup in front of him with a soft smile. Jake reached for it instinctively, and their fingers brushed briefly. He felt a jolt, not of surprise but of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed between them. It was not just admiration he felt for her anymore. It was something deeper, something that tugged at his heart in a way that left him both nervous and hopeful. The day brought challenges, as it always did on the ranch. A fence needed mending after a night of heavy rain, and a young colt was limping slightly, needing careful attention. Jake had become accustomed to Martha's support, but today felt different. He noticed almost with awe the way she moved through the tasks with patience and precision. She was calm, unhurried, yet completely effective. The colt, which had been tense and scared, relaxed completely under her gentle hands. Jake watched silently, his respect growing into something more. He felt grateful not just for her help, but for the way she seemed to bring order, calm, and even joy into his life. By midday, they were taking a break near the river that ran along the edge of the property. The sun was high, reflecting off the water, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming wildflowers. Martha sat on a flat rock, pulling off her boots to dip her feet in the cool water. Jake followed, sitting nearby, letting his boots soak. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with shared understanding rather than emptiness. Jake realized that he was beginning to cherish these moments, not for the work or the view, but simply for her company. As they rested, Jake found the courage to speak, hesitant but genuine. "Martha," he began, his voice low, I've been thinking." He paused, unsure how to continue. Martha turned her head, her expression patient and encouraging, giving him the space to speak. "I didn't expect all this," he said, gesturing to the ranch, the animals, and finally to her. "I didn't expect to care about anything beyond the work, and yet," he trailed off, unsure if he should finish the sentence. Martha waited silently, her eyes calm, her hands resting gently on her knees. Finally, she said, "Jake, whatever it is, you can tell me, I'm listening." Her voice was soft but firm, and Jake felt a rush of relief. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the strength, patience, and quiet love that had slowly grown over the past months. "I don't know when it started," he admitted, "but I can't imagine this ranch or my life without you. I care about you, Martha. More than I thought I could care about anyone." Martha's eyes softened, a smile spreading across her face. She had waited patiently for this moment, never rushing him, never forcing affection. "Jake," she said quietly, "I've hoped for this, but I never wanted to push you. I've cared about you from the start, in my own way." She reached out, taking his hand gently in hers. The warmth of her touch confirmed what he had been feeling for weeks, though he had been afraid to admit it even to himself. The confession changed everything. Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of peace and joy he had never known. He realized that Martha had not just become a part of his life, she had transformed it. Her patience, intelligence, and unwavering care had slowly but surely opened his heart, showing him a love that was steady, real, and enduring. For the first time, he understood that love was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about partnership, respect, and trust built over time. From that day onward, their relationship took on a new depth. Jake was no longer just reliant on Martha for practical help. He sought her company, her advice, and her opinion on matters large and small. Martha, in turn, continued to care for him and the ranch with the same patience and dedication. But now they shared a mutual understanding, a partnership founded on love as well as necessity. They laughed more easily together, shared stories, and found joy in the simple rhythms of ranch life. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a fence along the western pasture, Jake paused to watch Martha. The sun highlighted her hair, and the way she moved with confidence and grace took his breath away. Without thinking, he reached out and gently took her hand, squeezing it softly. Martha looked up at him, her eyes bright with affection, and squeezed back. They continued their work side by side, but now there was a new lightness in their steps, a sense of unity, trust, and budding intimacy that neither could ignore. Evenings became moments of quiet celebration. They would sit by the fire after long days of work, sharing hot food and stories, enjoying each other's company without the need for words to fill every silence. Jake sometimes found himself opening up about his fears, his dreams, and even his regrets, and Martha listened with unwavering patience. She offered comfort when needed, laughter when appropriate, and encouragement whenever he doubted himself. Jake realized that Martha's presence had given him something more than companionship. It had given him confidence, hope, and a sense of belonging. The town, too, began to notice the change. Neighbors who once whispered about the forced marriage now saw the couple working together, laughing together, and supporting each other through every challenge. People spoke in admiration of the transformation, noting how Martha's quiet strength had softened Jake's stubborn pride. Jake, however, no longer cared about gossip or judgment. He was too focused on the life he shared with Martha, the partnership they had built, and the love that had grown naturally between them. One late spring evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the sky was painted with soft shades of orange and pink, Jake and Martha walked along the edge of the fields. The ranch was quiet, the animals settled for the night, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh grass. Jake paused, taking Martha's hands in his. "Martha," he said softly, "I want you to know that I don't just care about you, I love you. I've come to love you, and I don't ever want to imagine my life without you." Martha's eyes glistened with tears of happiness. "Jake," she whispered, "I've loved you for a long time. I knew your heart would open when it was ready, and I waited because I believed in us. I love you too." The words hung between them, gentle yet powerful, carrying the weight of months of patience, understanding, and quiet devotion. Jake pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace, and in that moment, the ranch, the plains, and the life they had built together felt complete. The following weeks were filled with shared joy. They worked together, laughed together, and began dreaming together, not just about the ranch, but about a life filled with love, partnership, and companionship. The challenges that had once seemed overwhelming were now opportunities to support each other, and the quiet moments were cherished more than ever. Jake no longer saw Martha as the old maid the town had labeled her. He saw a strong, capable, intelligent, and loving woman who had slowly but surely captured his heart. One afternoon, as they rode side by side across the fields, Jake realized just how far they had come. The man who had once feared marriage, who had resisted connection, who had prided himself on independence, now felt complete with Martha by his side. He reached over and brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, smiling. Martha returned the smile, her eyes sparkling with affection. Together, they rode into the horizon, partners, lovers, and equals, their hearts intertwined by patience, understanding, and the slow, steady growth of real love. The townspeople who had once whispered about the forced marriage now spoke in admiration of the bond between Jake and Martha. The couple had transformed not just the ranch, but themselves. Jake's pride had softened into humility, his independence tempered with partnership. Martha's patience and quiet strength had been rewarded with love that was real, lasting, and deeply cherished. They had discovered that love was not a lightning strike, but a gentle, persistent current, one that carried them together through storms, through challenges, and into a shared future filled with hope and joy. In the end, Jake's heart was fully won. The cowboy who had once resisted marriage, who had feared losing his freedom, now embraced the life he had built with Martha, the life that was richer, fuller, and infinitely more meaningful because she was in it. They had faced challenges, weathered storms, and built trust, respect, and love one step at a time. And as they stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over their thriving ranch, they knew that their journey was just beginning, hand in hand, hearts bound together, ready for whatever the future might hold.